This video is about a topic that I feel very strongly about, but haven't really touched on that much during my time here on YouTube, primarily because I wasn't exactly sure how to best go about approaching the subject. People are very passionate about Warhammer lore, and while I don't want to rain on people's parade, I really truly do think that this is a conversation we need to have, because while lore is important and is crucial to give a game a direction and make it feel real, immersive, and magical, it should not be the end-all be-all of a game's balance, direction, and ideals. I know this might cause some confusion after my last video, where I said that I believe the bolter should be buffed in accordance in how it functions within the lore. I didn't specify what exactly I meant by that, which is on me, so allow me to do just that with this video. The lore of Warhammer is undeniably vast and extensive. There is no shortage of ways to interact with the series, including books, articles, games, videos, and more that allow you to immerse yourself within the realm of both 40k and fantasy, and it all does a fantastic job of setting the scene and transporting you to an alternate grimdark reality. However, the vastness and complexity of this lore makes it incredibly difficult for many to enjoy. The seemingly never-ending amount of information that is spread across various forms of media is both intimidating and expensive to obtain. The good news, though, is that the most popular forms of media within the Warhammer franchise, tabletop games and video games, are the easiest and cheapest to get into, which is why there are so many players of these forms of media and why a lot of people reference these mediums when referencing the lore. There is a special emphasis placed on the tabletop games, though, and while people do mention the books, those require a steep time investment that many are simply not willing to partake in. I do think there is an interesting debate to be had of, are tabletop games based on the lore, or is the lore guided by the rules of tabletop? Because I do think people tend to put extra emphasis on the more popular forms of media, but as most people within the Darktide community tend to point towards the tabletop game first and foremost when talking about lore, that is what I will be primarily referencing in this video. Also, keep in mind that I am very much not a lore expert in 40k. I am more familiar with fantasy lore personally, and all of the lore I reference in this video was found through brief research I have done by asking those who are more knowledgeable than me. I think it goes without saying that a tabletop game and a video game are inherently different, though. The two main types of tabletop games, tabletop RPGs and miniature war games, both have their own unique balance that stems from a very unique rule set tailored for that system. While video games can be created in the likeness of their tabletop variants, there is never a direct one-to-one translation of the rule set between these two mediums. This can be directly seen in the TTRPG space with the video game adaptations of Wrath of the Righteous, Rogue Trader, and Baldur's Gate 3. The first of these has about 16 full-length articles written by a fan that details all of the changes made from the core system of Pathfinder, which aims to make the rule set less complicated and more approachable for the general audience. The last of these has received numerous tweaks from the system of Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition to make it feel smoother and less subject to DM fiat. And the second, well, in all honesty, I'm not sure since I'm not familiar with the specific rule set of Rogue Trader since it's from a very specific rulebook released in 2008. From what I've read online, though, the amount of changes Owlcat Studios made to the core system of Rogue Trader makes the video game less of a port and more of a reimagining. Miniature war games should not be immune to this kind of treatment either. Games Workshop has, to my knowledge, never made a video game adaptation of their 40k tabletop game, which means the only way to experience 40k in a video game format is through various styles and genres of video games that exist online. In more plain terms, a team-based first-person melee shooter game like Darktide should not be subjected to the rules and balance ideals of tabletop, because they're not only different forms of media, they're entirely different genres to begin with, which have their own unique problems to tackle. For example, in the tabletop game, you cannot have a certain kind of troop be effective against too many things at once. This is because you have a plethora of other troops at your command, each of which have a different purpose to serve and role to fill within the army, and having a one-size-fits-all solution would completely erase the strategy required to use an army to their maximum potential. Additionally, if you have some troops that are worthless against some enemy troops, it doesn't matter from a metagame perspective since you are supposed to have other troops to help handle that. If your bolter units are worthless against the carapace armor charging your army, then you can simply move your bolter units back and have your plasma units take care of them. A video game like Darktide, on the other hand, cannot follow this exact same rule of balance. It's still important to ensure that nothing is too good at everything, as that would discount the team-based balance of the game like it would the army-based balance of the tabletop. However, unlike tabletop, you cannot have the same kind of polarizing weaknesses because you only have one character to control and not an entire army. It is true that Darktide is a team-based game, but team balance in a video game is very different than team balance or army balance in a tabletop game. Tabletop games are, at their core, social-based games where the entire focus is on the group and how they interact with each other, and because you control the entire army, there is nothing wrong with having a severe weakness built into the game. Team-based video games, on the other hand, is a medium that puts a significant amount of emphasis on the individual's experience, with special care to ensure that one is almost never overshadowed or made irrelevant by another, because being completely useless in a video game where you only control one character feels bad. You can make the argument that this would still be okay, as Darktide is a team-based video game and you should be willing to make sacrifices for your team, but the reality is that many people simply don't want to sacrifice their own fun for the sake of others. Video games as a whole are less social forms of entertainment that typically do not require you to interact with people beyond the bare minimum. In PvE games, you are only forced to interact with others when the game outright makes you, such as having to hit 2 buttons at once, or, in Darktide terms, rescuing someone from a poxhound or a trapper. Anything beyond that, and social interaction and teamwork is optional. Highly recommended and rewarded, mind you, but still ultimately optional. Even in competitive PvP games where social interaction and teamwork are technically required for you to win, people choose just to not interact with each other. Games like Overwatch, Valorant, and League all run into the exact same issues where an overwhelming amount of people simply do not communicate with their team in competitive matches because they're not forced to, which stems from the tendency for people to treat video games more as a solo experience rather than a team one. Outright forcing people to work with their team will cause more frustration and anger, especially in quick play, and will lead to an overall more miserable experience and make people leave the game. If you're interested as to the why of this statement, I talk about this topic much more in depth in my How Do You Balance the Tide Games video, so I'd highly recommend checking that out. Now, do highly team-oriented games exist that require your team to talk with each other? Of course, but those games are ultimately niche and tiny, and do not really go much of anywhere at all. Darktide has the potential to be much bigger, and while some of that potential is lost due to how Fatshark handled the launch, there is still the potential for genuine growth, but that can only come if the balance makes the game fun for a majority rather than the minority. A problem that I see with the argument of lore accuracy, or tabletop accuracy, in a game like Darktide is that there is an underlying desire to sacrifice the fun factor of the game for the sake of lore, with so many people pointing to the tabletop games as an example of the kind of balance that should be followed. In 40k tabletop, it makes sense that certain troops armed with certain weapons would have very polarizing weaknesses. You have an entire army at your control, so it doesn't matter if 1 or 2 of your troops are worthless against, say, demons, because the expectation is that you have other troops at your disposal to make up for that weakness. In a game like Darktide, though, the rules are different. It is very important to ensure that no weapon is good at everything, because that would be overpowered and discount the team-based aspect of the game, but it's also important to ensure that nothing is worthless against too much within the game. You do have a team to help cover your weaknesses, but you do not control them like you do in tabletop, and being unable to do anything versus too many enemy types in the game would not only make that weapon not very good, but it also just wouldn't be fun. In tabletop, you have other units to control, which allows you to stay within the game, but that would translate in Darktide as being just more of a spectator. Weaknesses between the various weapons in Darktide are crucial to ensure the game is balanced for a team experience and a personal one, as pairing melee weapons and ranged weapons together to help cover your own weaknesses is also a fun and integral part of the game, but the polarizing weaknesses that sometimes exist in tabletop must be traded out for less polarizing weaknesses in Darktide to ensure that the weapons are still fun to use. There's nothing wrong with the weapon being worthless against one enemy type, or a small handful of weapons being worthless against 2, or in a very, very specific and special circumstance, 3, but anything more in Darktide would simply just not be fun. And even then, there is still a specific level of nuance that is required when considering balance. For instance, the Flamer is really only good against hordes, but everyone would agree that if the Flamer completely obliterated hordes, flak, and carapace armor, then it would be incredibly overpowered. While that might be fun for the person using it, it certainly would not be fun for the rest of the team, and the fun of 3 outweighs the fun of 1. The amount of moving parts and things to consider in a game like Darktide makes balance hard and complicated, and while there are obviously wrong answers, there are many different right answers, and limiting balance for the sake of lore makes balancing that much more difficult. Kind of veering off the lore talk for a second, something else that I've heard in regards to balance is that it's okay to keep Darktide's current version of the bolter closer to the lore in order to make room for a heavy bolter for the Ogryn, with the general idea that the Ogryn's heavy bolter would be more of a carapace and monster busting tool, whereas the lock bolt gun would be better suited for smaller targets. I personally see 2 main issues with this, the first being that we don't have a heavy bolter in the game. I'm all for theory crafting new toys for us to play with and who they could go to, but we have absolutely no idea if we are ever going to get a heavy bolter in the game in the first place, and I don't think it's a good idea to balance a weapon based upon what could be. We should balance based upon what we have in the game right now. Also, from what I understand in the lore, Ogryns are not allowed to wield bolters of any kind in the first place. All of their ranged weaponry have limiters directly built in to limit the damage that they could cause, which is why, despite being capable physically of wielding a heavy bolter, Ogryns are not trusted with that kind of power. Even Nork Deadog, the smartest Ogryn in all of 40k lore, never used a bolter, so why would our Ogryns be trusted with them? Now, in a TTRPG called Only Wars, a supplemental book called Shield of Humanity released a Gunlugger class for the Ogryn that does explicitly list heavy bolters as a usable weapon, so technically there is lore that supports Ogryns using heavy bolters. However, it's strange to me that seemingly well-established and widely agreed upon lore is contradicted by a single TTRPG released in 2012 that, as of now, is officially out of print. Why is there nothing else in the lore that supports this? This is kind of irritating because the question now shifts to, do we listen to one single example from a discontinued 10-year-old product, or do we go with the established lore that is supported by pretty much everything else within the sphere of 40k? Now, keep in mind, I don't bring this up to argue lore for the sake of lore. At the end of the day, what you or I think would be acceptable or not in regards to the lore is irrelevant, because Games Workshop is the end-all be-all of what is allowed. They are certainly not afraid to say no to a character wielding certain weapons. We saw this in Vermintide when Grail Knight got locked out of using the Tusk or Spear, as Grail Knights are not allowed to use spears in the lore due to them being considered peasantry weapons. I can absolutely see a timeline in which Games Workshop says no to Ogryns using heavy bolters, and thereby choosing to retcon Only War, which is also the main reason why I don't think it's a good idea to talk about the heavy bolter in regards to the balance of the default bolter. Is it possible Games Workshop chooses to approve that bit and officially allow Ogryns to use heavy bolters? Absolutely, but we have no idea, and won't until Darktide actually gets one. Anyway, I think we can all agree that Darktide as a whole is not very realistic in the terms of lore anyway. 4 rejects taking on a horde of Nurgle-infested zombies is already a pretty big stretch, as simply being touched by a Plague Ogryn should make them die a horrible death instantly, and simply encountering a demon host should be enough for the rejects to be executed on their return, for fear of the encounter opening them up to demonic influence. Also, the male loner psyker is borderline heretical in his thinking and speech and would probably be executed for his thoughts. And this is all not to mention just how much lore is out there and how hard it is to get solid information that isn't contradicted or invalidated by something else. And the retcons. Oh my god, the retcons. All of this is to say that the lore should not be the end-all be-all of balance, and that adhering too close to the lore too often causes more problems than they're worth. However, this does not mean that the lore cannot be taken into account when balance is being made. There is nothing wrong with using the lore to softly guide the balance of a weapon to ensure it doesn't stray too far from its original vision, and rather than looking at the specifics, we should be looking at the overall picture to determine how to best proceed. It's easy to miss the forest for the trees, so to speak, and having a much broader outlook that allows for a healthy amount of wiggle room would ensure the best of both worlds. We get a lore-accurate, badass title that everyone loves and has fun with. But at the end of the day, we really have no say in the matter of lore. All hail Games Workshop!